This program is brought to you by Emory University.
I'm really happy that she's able to make the trip to be here with us today. And from my perspective, Tracy's really one of the sort of giants in our field. She's made incredible contributions through a combination of innovative and impactful clinical research, mentorship of tons of clinicians and clinician scientists, and really a wonderful person and colleague. She's did her undergraduate work at Yale, did medical school at Harvard and residency at the Brigham, and then went to Duke for fellowship, where she stayed for quite some time. She was on faculty at Duke for 14 years, became a tenured professor there, was director of health services research and outcomes research at the DCRI. And then in 22, made an important move, a really significant move to PCORI to become the Chief Comparative Effectiveness Research Officer, where she oversees a more than $500 million portfolio of projects that really are doing incredible work to advance patient-centered outcomes through comparative effectiveness studies. As a scholar, Tracy has more than 350 peer-reviewed papers, many of which are focused on care of patients with acute MI. She's also done really interesting clinical trials, from traditional clinical trials of medical therapy for anticoagulation to a really interesting trial called Artemis that looked at mitigating financial barriers to therapy. Her work is really broad and impactful. She's won teaching awards at every institution she's been a part of. She won the AHA Q-Core Lifetime Achievement Award a few years ago and has been a part of countless AHA and ACC writing groups. She's on the editorial board at Circ and American Heart Journal and associate editor at JAMA Internal Medicine. And I think maybe as impressive as anything else, when you look at her list of more than 40 mentees, there are a lot of people who are really doing wonderful things in the world today. So it's really a pleasure to introduce Tracy. Abi Goyal trained with Tracy and wanted to say a couple of quick words as well. I will turn this over to Abi and then to Tracy to talk to us about integration of healthcare system data to drive healthcare improvements and patient-centered outcomes.
I'll keep this brief. Tracy and I were contemporaries at Duke. We were co-fellows. And if I were to just sum it up, everything that Tracy touches, she just makes better. All right, that's from a mentor standpoint, from a collaborator standpoint, from a thought input standpoint. And rare people like her are gems, such that within 15 years of starting as an attending at Duke, she was awarded the Lifetime Achievement Award with the Quality of Care and Outcomes Research Council at AHA, which is that might be a record for the youngest person ever to get a Lifetime Achievement Award, and it's super well deserved. Just in terms of literally everything she touches gets better, and she's just a really, really nice human being. So we're super excited to have you, Tracy. Thank you so much.
Thanks for those kind words. And it's wonderful to be here today. When Neil said I started fellowship at Duke and stayed for a few years, the thought did cross my mind, maybe I failed the fellowship a few years. Is that why I got held back a few years? No. So I've traversed a lot of different aspects of the career. I actually started as a basic scientist. I'm one of those distracted people that every few years changes a little bit. So I started out as a basic scientist working in the lab. Did my share of spreading P32 joy throughout the lab. That's radioactive materials, which I did actually spill in the lab at 3 o'clock in the morning and had to call radiation safety. After that, I had some second thoughts about being in the lab. No, I'm just kidding. To starting a career at Duke first as primarily a clinical cardiologist, and then as part of that, realizing that there were some questions that I really would like to get answers to, that where the answers weren't there, and so embarked on a clinical research career, getting some more training in clinical research while I was at Duke. And then really enjoying life as a clinical researcher. And then this phenomenal opportunity came about 3 years ago to actually try to do clinical research, hopefully on a slightly larger, more national scale. And so that's how I ended up at PCORI. I still love seeing patients. I actually took a few years off from seeing patients for a while because learning a new job was challenging. It was learning. I wanted to make sure I could focus on that, to really learn how to run a funding institute and a research funding program. But then I decided that I really needed to get back into patient care, and I think that's one of the things that keeps me really grounded. So I am also currently at Stanford doing some clinical rotations. And yes, I realize that Stanford and DC are kind of far apart, but these days life is always very interesting. So I thought I would talk a little bit today about research to drive improvements in patient care. And I think this is where Neil said, hey, can you talk a little bit about sort of learning health systems and how they could really be used and leveraged for clinical research? So this is what I'm going to talk about today in terms of aims. And of course, being from PCORI, I'd love to see all of you apply for PCORI funding. So I'm going to spend a few minutes at the end of the day talking a little bit about what exactly it is that PCORI funds, and hopefully inspire some of you to send things our way as well. So at the top is Rob Matthews, is one of my former colleagues and mentees. And this is some of the early work that we did looking at just plain old, what I call vitamins of post-MI management. These are things that almost every patient should be discharged on and hopefully stay on for a good long time. Some of the evidence is changing for some of these classes of therapy. And the curves show the distribution of adherence to these medications, even as short as 90 days after discharge. And you can see here, there's actually quite a lot of variability, perhaps a little more adherence on something like P2Y12, which is good given that most of these patients are stented. But for things like statin, you can see it could range from 50% all the way up to 80%. So that is the not so great part of things. And we do realize that there are some practice-based reasons for why adherence is not optimal, but there are also reality-based reasons like social determinants of health that make things challenging for the population that it's intended for to be able to access therapies as well as to be able to afford therapies. And this is, again, one of those studies Dr. Essien, one of my collaborators, did looking at use of of anticoagulants for AFib in different racial ethnic groups. Neil mentioned the Artemis trial, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about the Artemis trial because, quite frankly, it's one of the most interesting trials I've ever had the privilege of being part of. It's interesting for a number of reasons, one of which is it was actually sponsored by pharma, which is interesting because this is basically a trial of MI patients. Oops, going back one. But it's not really a drug trial per se. This is one where guidelines say, hey, once you've had an MI, you need to be on drug, on a P2Y12 inhibitor for a year. And then guidelines also gave a stronger preference to higher potency P2Y12, like ticagrelor and prasugrel. Not for everyone, excuse me, not for everyone, but for folks who had no contraindications to those kinds of therapies. And yet we knew that most patients were getting the nice generic clopidogrel therapy, and very few, despite the mortality and MACE benefits for these higher potency drugs, were getting that. So this was a trial where we were hoping to change practice. We didn't want to just change patient practice, we wanted to change clinician practice as well. And so we cluster randomized 300 sites. These are hospitals across the US, to usual care, which is basically they did what they usually did. They treated a patient, sent the patient home with a prescription, the typical follow-up. And then half of the hospitals got a copayment intervention where they were able to give patients, and this is where I'm always astounded that AstraZeneca was willing to fund this, a copayment card so that when they go to the pharmacy, they have their copayment waived for whatever P2Y12 inhibitor they were prescribed. Now, notably, we didn't say, even though AstraZeneca was funding this, we didn't say you have to use ticagrelor. We left that up to the clinician who was discharging the patient. But when the patient went to the pharmacy, regardless of if they were filling ticagrelor or clopidogrel, they could get the card and just get their P2Y12 copayment, the out-of-pocket cost, completely waived. Okay, so we wanted the clinicians to try to prescribe what they usually prescribe, with the hypothesis that if we untied the clinician's hands, because we took patient costs out of the equation, that maybe clinicians would be more likely to be adherent to guidelines. And then on the patient side, we were hoping that if we waived their out-of-pocket costs, that from a behavior standpoint, there would be less of a barrier to being able to stay adherent to this medication for the 12 months that they were supposed to be per guidelines. Okay, so that was the setup of the study. Let me get to the bottom line here. So we had several outcomes. The first was to look at clinician behavior. And did we change behavior? I think we did. As I mentioned before, there was never an intent to get everyone onto a higher potency, because some patients just shouldn't be on one. But there was this idea that guidelines said, at that time it was a 2A recommendation, that higher potency was better. And so, as you can see in the intervention arm, we did shift a number of these patients, but not actually as many as I thought we would be able to shift. So there's room for improvement away from clopidogrel onto a higher potency. So the clopidogrel use went from 54% to about 36%. Okay, so that was significant. And then we started looking at 1-year persistence or adherence to therapy. Okay, and there are lots of ways you can assess persistence. There are very practical ways of assessing persistence, which is simply asking the patient, how are you taking it? Are you still taking it? Let's not talk about adherence, because adherence requires you to take it every day. Let's just talk about persistence. Are you continuing to take it? Okay. So there's one way of doing that. You can ask the patient, and that's what we generally do as part of day-to-day lives. But being physicians, we are cynical. And being cynical, we don't always necessarily believe someone when they say that they're, so we've got to validate. So what do? We connected to pharmacy fills. We took a large pharmacy database that covers about 90% of pharmacies and their dispensings across the entire United States. And we linked these patients to that pharmacy database. And we looked at fills of the prescription. And so that was one way to validate. But filling a prescription doesn't necessarily mean that they're actually putting that pill in their mouth. So we chose to validate it a third way. Just call me really cynical, but we just needed to do this. So what do? We sent a phlebotomist to go, ding dong, I'm here to draw blood from you, or come to a clinic and we'll draw blood on you. And we were looking for metabolites of that drug in the patient's blood system. Again, not a perfect way, and we can't do this for every single patient out there, but it was a way, and you see the different sample sizes for each of these methods. We could do patient report for everyone in the trial, so all 10,000 patients could do patient report because they would just answer a phone, say, I'm still on it, I'm not on it. We could link pharmacy records for about 8,000 of these, so a good sample, and there wasn't too much difference between the sample that could be linked versus the sample that couldn't be linked. And then probably the most selection bias is the pharmacy draw, because obviously some patients won't consent to a blood draw, which is invasive. But the good thing is we saw pretty consistent results across all of these things. So maybe some of us need to be a little less cynical about patient report, but you can see based on the numbers that you see on this slide that I won't go into, that in all of these methods, the intervention arm did improve medication persistence of the P2Y12 inhibitor. So that's a really good thing, again, result of the trial. Now, we only covered the P2Y12. We didn't cover any of the other, what I call vitamins post-MI, like beta blockers, statins, ACE inhibitor therapy. But it was kind of interesting when you look at these therapies, we also seem to show an association between the intervention and greater persistence to those therapies. And it may be a habitual thing, like if you're doing well with one drug, you might as well do it with the other. Or maybe because among all of these, P2Y12 is the most expensive of them all, that you just took that financial hardship angle out of the picture. And I think it might be a little bit of both. We were able, this is Alex Vanneroff. He was also a former colleague of ours at Duke, currently working with Neil very closely on the AHA-SFRN. He's an interventional cardiologist currently at Penn, and an incredible human being as well. So he was able to show that there really was a little bit of a spillover effect, if you will, on other medications. So at the end of the day, when you do a clinical trial, you really hope that it actually has an impact. Okay. And this was a hospital level intervention. And so at the beginning of the study, we asked the hospital, if someone can't afford to be on a P2Y12, what do you do? Okay. Some hospitals, a very small minority of the hospitals, say, well, this is so incredibly important, we're going to take money from our accounts and we're going to help them pay for these drugs, or we're going to give them free drug. Okay. Some of them spend the resources to get patients connected to pharma assistance programs and help the patient traverse that. There's a lot of paperwork that goes in those, and not every patient is eligible for that. And then about half of hospitals just simply say, well, it's just hard. We'll go with the generic if we can, but we just don't have the personnel or the resources to be able to do this. So now we've got this trial result that we shared with these hospitals, and we said, which seemed to show that if you provide some sort of copayment assistance to these patients, clinicians do the right thing and patients are able to do the right thing. What do you do now? So at the end of the trial, half of these folks in the hospitals in the red actually converted to providing some assistance. So they learned from their participation in this study. They looked at their own data and they were able to change their practice, which is always a nice thing to be thinking about when you think about an impact of a clinical trial. Now, I'd like to say that we solved all the problems, but we didn't, because our third major endpoint, which was the endpoint we were powered for as a co-primary, was hopefully if clinicians were doing the right thing, patients were doing more persistence with therapy, we would change outcomes. We would make patients better. And unfortunately, looking at the overlap of these two curves, that didn't happen. It really didn't happen. And so this question had me scratching my head for a couple of years, actually. One of which is, now I'm one of those person, you give me a coupon, I'm gonna figure out a way to use that coupon. 50 cents off of a candy bar, I'm gonna go buy myself a candy bar. Unfortunately, that mentality is not prevalent in our population. 28% of the intervention arm folks got a voucher that covered the drug costs when they go to the pharmacy, didn't use it. They just didn't use it. Now, you have no idea how much I struggle with this concept, because 50 cents, I'm there. 25 cents, I'm still there. And here was something that, gave several dollars, in fact, sometimes several tens of dollars, and people weren't using it. And if you looked at the outcomes of these folks who didn't use their voucher, not once in the next 12 months that they had the voucher to use, not a single time, not even one time, you'll see that that's the yellow line. These are the patients who generally were going to do poorly anyway. Okay. Now, this is a post hoc analysis, so you can't really legitimately compare usual care to the ones, what I call as treated, the ones who actually did what they were told and used the voucher. But if you took a look at that, you might be a little bit more encouraged. Those who used it might have done better. But again, post hoc analysis, take it with a grain of salt. So what did Alex do next? He started figuring out which factors predicted voucher use and which factors didn't predict voucher use, and found that among patients who had high likelihood of voucher use, we did try to confirm that these are patients who stayed on drug the most, or more likely to stay on the drug. And you saw the clinical outcomes, these are the ones. But this also basically says one size doesn't fit all. And so when you do an intervention, it's also really important to think about the implementation aspect of that intervention. Again, you're taking this back into the healthcare setting and you're saying, okay, well, these are the patients who would probably be more likely to use your intervention. And then it carves out the population of patients where you haven't quite solved the problem yet, where you need to do the next research question. And this is kind of how I envision sort of the learning health system. Now let's get back to why people choose not to follow advice. Well, we don't know everything. We think we know everything most of the time. But especially when it comes to putting ourselves in the patient's shoes, sometimes we find that we are not necessarily even talking the same language, let alone sharing the same concepts. This is a study we did with 2 patient advocacy organizations, and those are 2 patients who were part of the study. We co-designed the study together. And it was looking at something like anticoagulation for AFib, and it was looking at warfarin versus DOAC. And, you know, the things that I always thought drove patient adherence were things like cost of the medication, which is always important, but it's interesting. Blue is what the physician thinks is important, is what proportion of physicians felt this was important. Orange is what proportion of patients felt this was important. So we both felt that this was important, but the physician felt it was more important than the patient did. Interesting insights that we learned. Even though we think INR testing is a pain in the rear end to do, there is a comfort that patients derive from knowing that there's a blood test that measures that the drug is actually working. So it's actually pivoted my way of thinking about it. I'm like, here, this is your Xarelto or a Pixpan or whatever it is. You know the drug's working because you're going to now bleed. And that's a way to tell people, that's how you know. I don't need a fancy test to tell you. You're just going to know that if you bump your arm against against something, you're going to have a big old bruise, and that's telling you that the drug's working, because patients want that validation that the drug is actually doing something. It was also interesting that patients really prioritize this idea of being able to dose reduce something if something were to come back, which is interesting, because we always thought one size fits all, less variability in practice, this is good. But that's not necessarily how patients think. So it's really important to get that patient community stakeholder type of input. It's also important for us to design the trials that patients really want to actually know the results. So how many times have we been frustrated in clinic when we're like, a statin is really good for you? And they're like, can I try garlic instead? So this was a study that was done out of Cleveland Clinic that I was lucky to be part of, where I really appreciated that they took a question that was super important to a patient and looked at fish oil, cinnamon, don't roll your eyes, guys, garlic, turmeric, plant sterols, red yeast rice extract, and compared it to 5 milligrams of rosuvastatin. And then they looked at LDL lowering. And so when this study was finished, I made a big old poster of this study, of this graphic, and I put it up on my clinic wall. Like, this is why I don't want you to take garlic. Really, I don't want you to take garlic. It raises your cholesterol. And, you know, these are the kinds of things where, you know, the patient driving the question is super important to us being able to do our jobs in clinic. Which then gets me to, how do we get the patients to be part of the clinical trial process? So this was the consent form that we wrote for a study that I did a while ago. Let's see, it says 2015 approved, but this was the PALM registry. It was a lipid registry, a lipid lowering registry. It was done around the time when I think 2013 guideline changed for lipids. And so we wanted to create a study around some of the changes around that time. Peter, you remember this study very, very well. So this was a study that did very little. It collected information while the patient was sitting in clinic one time, and it drew a tube of blood to measure their cholesterol. It required a 7-page consent form to do that. 7 pages. Ridiculous. This is what our IRB said, 7 pages. So we said, look, we wanted to put this into the clinical workflow at clinic. And if you made someone read 7 pages sitting in a clinic room, then your workflow as a clinician is totally disrupted because they're just going to sit in there for like 45 minutes. They're probably also going to stop at page 3 and be like, you know what, I got to go to my next appointment. So this didn't work. So what we wanted to do was to change it up a little bit. We wanted a video consent where someone could listen to someone telling them. We didn't have the resources to put nurses in all of these clinics to read everything to them, or study coordinators in all of these clinics. So we took that script. For the IRB originally said, look, just have someone read those 8 pages. We did that. That came out to 32 minutes video. And we said, no one's going to listen to a 32-minute video. So we worked with the IRB quite intensely to drill it down to an 8-minute video total. And then we broke it down into snippets, and we put this in this Candyland type of format, or Snakes and Ladders kind of format, where it's gamified a little bit to keep things interesting. And we put it on an iPad, which was really cool around that time, 2013, 2014. And when patients checked in for their clinic appointment, we handed the iPad to them and said, while you're waiting, take a look at this. Okay. And in it, we had videos that showcased different people that were part of the research team, not just the PI, not just the coordinator, but different people, including some of our patient partners as part of that as well. And this is what the enrollment curve looked like. So what's in blue, the dotted line, that was our planned enrollment curve. The red was the actual enrollment curve. So notice 2 things. One is we started later. Why? iOS changed right around March of that year. And so we had to redo our app to shift it to the new iOS. That set us back by about a month. But notice where the red line ended. We ended about 6 weeks early. We actually ended right around AHA of that year, because we were at AHA and they're like, Tracy, we're almost done. I said, okay, well, shut it down tomorrow. And they're like, are you sure tomorrow? I'm like, yes, we're sure tomorrow. Shut it down tomorrow. And so within 1 day, we had overshot our enrollment target by about 60 patients or 60 participants. That's how people were into this kind of study. So this is sort of an example of how we can also get patient-centered design into the process of doing research. And it was also kind of interesting because, we had some institutions that really embraced this video and some institution IRBs that were like, we're not doing this. It wasn't randomized, but it was kind of random. And you could see that the sites, there were 175 sites that were part of this study. The sites that did use the video seemed to have more people who were of advanced age, and seemed to have a more ethnically diverse population enrolled into the study, and perhaps a lower health literacy type of population enrolled in the study. And it kind of makes sense. You're not confronted with this behemoth of a consent form. And if you were sitting in clinic and you forgot to bring your reading glasses, it's nice to have someone just kind of chat you through these kinds of things. So really interesting there. So that was the end of my quote, the end of my academic career. Just kind of wanted to give you a sense of some of the things that I had the privilege of being part of. And I'm going to skip this slide because this kind of was a transition to sort of how I was thinking about a career at PCORI. I was very attracted to PCORI because a lot of the things that I just highlighted as part of some of the studies that I participated in really was embodied in this organization. So first of all, we're federally funded, but we're actually an independent nonprofit, which these days is actually a very important thing. Second, we, the Institute came into being because of patients. Patients basically went to their Congress people and said, we want to make sure that there are studies funded that serve our needs. Okay, and so that's what PCORI was developed for. So PCORI doesn't really fund discovery science. PCORI funds everyday clinical dilemmas that are seen in typical typical day-to-day practice. And we fund a lot. We primarily fund research, and we have a portfolio of about $4 billion that I help to manage. And this is actually a little outdated. We have more than 2,000 studies at this time. We also fund engagement awards, which I'm going to spend a little bit of time on because not everyone knows about these. Dissemination and implementation awards. And then probably many of you have heard of PCORE-Net, which is a research infrastructure. So what are the critical things? One of the critical things about PCORE is because we were started by patients, we require patients to be part of the process. Now, in the old days when I was doing research, we would have focus groups, and now we were like, oh, that's patient-centered. That's not patient-centered by PCORE standard. PCORE requires patients to be part of the design process, the research conduct process, and the research results dissemination process. So every phase of the clinical research project requires patient community stakeholders. I'll give you some examples of these. It's a comparative clinical effectiveness research institution, so you have to be comparative, which means you should have at least two things you're trying to compare. It's not epidemiology, okay? And real-world populations, routine sort of clinical care settings, and we know one size doesn't fit all, so we encourage subgroup types of analyses. In fact, most of our studies are powered 90+% to be able to allow for significant powered subgroup analyses. So I'll give you a couple of examples of things, and especially things that are sort of unique to the applications that ultimately get chosen to be funded by PCORE, just to kind of give you a sense of this. So this one is a pretty darn straightforward study. It's basically looking at the population of pregnant people who are at risk of hypertensive disorders of pregnancy. I believe that prevalence is probably pretty high in this neck of the woods. It's certainly high in North Carolina, where I used to practice. And it's comparing two aspirin doses, 81 milligrams versus 162 milligrams, to try to prevent the incidence of hypertensive disorders of pregnancy, like preeclampsia, for example. So this is an RCT. It's actually one of the few RCTs that we have that's actually double-blinded, because it's really hard to eliminate bias if it's an open label type of study. It was also one of the lessons we learned from the adaptable study that we funded many, many years ago, which was open level. It involved 11 sites and will ultimately recruit 10,000 plus participants in this. And it's very interesting because this is a community of individuals that don't always feel that enthusiasm for being part of a clinical trial. So every single one of these 11 sites has its own community advisory board, where they have folks in that board that include community advocates, patient advocates, local policymakers, like health departments, for example, as well as patients that are part of that advisory board that are helping them think of ways to make sure that the study is successful, starting from how the study is implemented or started up, all the way through, hopefully at the end of the day, getting those results into practice. And you can see the outcomes at the bottom. That the primary, it's a nice clinically significant and clinically relevant primary endpoint, looking at the incidence of hypertensive disorders of pregnancy, but it's also powered for some very nice subgroups that might drive that incidence a little bit more. So, and then there are some maternal as well as some child-related outcomes that could be very interesting from this as well, which are secondary outcomes. So just kind of wanted to give you that as an example of patient engagement, community engagement. This other study that we funded is also incredibly interesting, and it's interesting from a system standpoint. We all have patients who have pacemakers and defibrillators. At least back when I was taking care of a lot of these patients, we knew that they had telephonic follow-up, and then they had to show up in clinic twice a year kind of thing. And it's just purely to maintain that piece of machine that's sitting in their chest. So this is a group that's comparing two ways of doing this. One is guideline-based care, which is pretty much what I just described. and one which is, let's only check when there's a problem, which is alert-driven or patient-initiated, which I think would substantially reduce the volume of work to device maintenance here. Now, I talked to my mechanic at the shop, and he was just like, "Oh, that's a bad idea. That's a really, really bad idea." So maybe that'll also bear out as the result of the study gets made known. But they're looking at two co-primary endpoints. One is the safety one, which really is the primary one, making sure that these patients do well. And then there's an effectiveness one, which I'm almost willing to bet they're going to win on, because you're just taking away some of the burden of follow-up. Now, this study, why do we think this was why did our application peer reviewers love the study? Well, at the outset, when they designed the study, they had already gotten a lot of buy-in to this. So they had the FDA involved, they had HRS involved, they had device industries involved. And so this made our peer reviewers think, wow, once the study results come out, it's going to change practice, because all of these guys are involved and they're already engaged. They're waiting to see what's going on. They've put shared input into this study. So that's another success factor, if you will, for PCORI applications that come in. Now, not everything needs to be these grand old projects. This is one that's relatively small. It's looking at deprescribing, which I also think is a really interesting concept. This idea that, as we get older, more and more medications get layered on, and sometimes it's important to just take a nice hard look and say, all right, do we really need all of these things? And so this is a group out of Kaiser. It was just published in JAMA Internal Medicine, a little self-promotion as an associate editor there, that looked at ways of either educating clinicians to try to deprescribe more, which you could argue is never effective in and of itself, versus looking at patient and clinician interventions to try to improve deprescribing. So I invite you to take a closer look at this study. It just came out, but it's a study of a nice, I think, relatively small, but very clinically impactful, I think, study, thinking about something that is a pretty significant problem in healthcare. So does PCORI like cardiovascular studies? We love cardiovascular studies, and it's not just because I'm there. But every year we come up with a list of topics that we'd like to emphasize, and cardiovascular has been on our list for a couple of years now. It's getting to a point where we're just seeing a lot of cardiovascular studies come in now. It's less critical for us to emphasize the need for cardiovascular studies, but it's really been something that we've emphasized over time. I'm just going to lightly cover this slide in terms of giving you the sense that we don't just want patient input. We don't just want patient consultation. We want patients to be part of the study leadership. And in fact, a lot of these studies have patient-led components to this, where it's not PI-led, it's not co-PI-led, it's not physician-led, it's not PhD-led, it's led by the patient co-investigators. So it's these are the kind, as you get to the right of the spectrum, that's what we're looking for at PCORI. It's not easy to do patient engagement. A lot of patients, you have to find the right folks, you have to give them training. If you need help, there's actually some links here, and I'm happy to share the deck afterwards so you could take a look at that QR code link. Lots of resources to help bring on more patient co-investigators, as well as to help researchers more effectively collaborate, to have these multi-stakeholder leadership teams. Now, you might be asking what kind of funding opportunities we have. The things that I'm going to focus on the most are probably on the left-hand side of the slide, where we have broad pragmatic studies and topic focused that generally offer awards anywhere from several $100,000 up to $12 million, depending on what you propose. Broad is basically, what are you interested in? Is it justified? Bring it in. We don't tell you what topic. We can do anything. Topic is when we are seeing a gap in funding in a specific area, and so we're going to call for funding in that area. Then there's a category of research applications that's larger, that's placer. That gives you up to $22 million in direct costs. These generally tend to be multi-center randomized trials. They tend to have a independent DCC and a CCC, all the sort of bells and whistles of doing research. And these are what we consider high risk, high reward type of investments. So we pay a lot of attention to that. There's a feasibility phase. If you don't meet all the metrics of the feasibility phase, you don't get to move on to the full phase of the study. Okay. We're always looking for proven ways to engage with the patient community, and that's what the science of engagement is. It's for folks who really want to say, well, is this the right way to get someone in versus this? And really using scientific methods to compare and make sure that one is better than the other. And then we have methods projects that are funding ways to improve study analyses or study setup, some of the ethics concerns. So that's also a category of award for us. And we generally offer all of these on a cyclic basis 3 times a year. I mentioned I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the other awards. These are smaller funding dollars, as you can see. But someone's asked me the question, okay, we want patient engagement. You want patient engagement in your application. We don't have the resources to do all that pre-work. I mean, how are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to do this on our free time, on our own dime? Well, you don't have to. So you can actually get an engagement award up to $300,000 to help you do that pre-work, to really build that relationship, to develop some of these ideas together, and then go in for a research award. So that's that capacity building award up there. On the back end, when the research results are out and people are like, okay, well, how do I get this into practice? Here's some D&I funding for you for PCORI research results. You have a new area, this area really hasn't gotten a whole lot of stakeholder conversations. You need some money to help bring folks together to have those kinds of conversations. You've got a smaller stakeholder convening award. These things we think are critical to the research process. So these aren't research funding per se, but these are things that we hope will pave the way to research or pave the way from research to get results to get adopted into clinical practice. So I encourage you all to look at some of these as well if you need to. The last few things I'm going to say is, are we reviewed differently? We don't like wasting people's time. We know that making an application, sometimes a 400-page effort, is not trivial. And it really sucks, especially in this funding environment, to get through all of that at the end of the day and get a no. So we have a 2-stage process. One is something called a letter of intent. It's a 3-page document. You send that in to us. We give you the green light, yes or no, whether or not you get to go to the application phase. So if the idea is not interesting to us, we're just going to stop you right there. The one thing I do want to say about merit review, which is our way of saying application peer review, is keep in mind, we don't just give a nod to the patient engagement, to the patient and the healthcare community. They make up collectively 1/3 of our merit reviewers for every single application. Okay, so they're looking for things that they need to look for, not just the science. So make sure you have that in mind as you're putting these kinds of applications together. What are we looking for? I try to get very granular about this, thinking about it from a PCOTS framework. Population, we want patients in these studies or people in these studies who have the need to be in these studies. So either they have high prevalence, high burden of disease, or large existing variations in care, and you should justify that. Interventions. We don't fund phase 2 novel discovery things. We want things that patients or clinicians in their day-to-day lives are saying, I could use this, or I could use this. I could do this, I could do this. Which one do I pick? So it's typically something that already has established efficacy, but uncertain effectiveness, or things that are in widespread use without that efficacy evidence behind it. The outcome needs to be carefully patient-centered and selected. We don't want this done in a pure laboratory setting. We want this done in routine healthcare. We do want it done rigorously, and we have a set of methodology standards that we generally want people to adhere to. And where necessary, we think that you should propose things that are perhaps powered high enough so that your subgroups could also be powered to really understand, or you have some sort of population enrichment criteria that allows you to address some of these questions in key subgroups of interest. So those are some of the sort of granular recommendations that I would make. I kind of covered a lot of what's on the slide, and you can read this, but we don't really fund preliminary science. We don't really fund things that are quality improvement and focus solely on quality improvement. We don't fund pharmacokinetic types of things. And by congressional mandate, we don't compare different policies or cost effectiveness research. So those are some of the things that are critical to sort of keep in mind. I do want to make sure you're aware of the broad practice. I'm going to bring it up again. This is sort of our bread and butter application funding opportunity. We love to see applications come this. It could be any topic area. You could have a small project, a medium-sized project, a larger project that goes up to $12 million. The maximum research period is always going to be 5 years, so you can't exceed that, okay? And every once in a while, we put things in there in this funding announcement to say, we especially welcome X, Y, and Z, okay? So look at those funding announcements. I also wanted to give you a heads up on a brand new funding opportunity. We just created this a month ago. That is focused on retrospective observational data. It's basically taking data and data infrastructures that already exists and making sure we can get rigorous CER from this. It has a 2-year project period. There's some more information coming out in December. We just put the pre-announcement out just to kind of let folks know about it. But this is a brand new opportunity for us. And so I just kind of wanted to let you know about that. So at the end of the day, I hope I gave you some sense of what, some examples of learning health systems and how research and clinical care might be blended together to try to better deploy some of our healthcare resources, more wisely deploy some of our healthcare resources, but also to better improve patient outcomes. And then I gave you some of sort of the key tenets of PCORI funding, which is this idea that research really can't be done just in an ivory tower. It really does require significant contribution and collaboration amongst different stakeholders here, with that sort of full decision-making shared among that community stakeholders from the design process all the way through the dissemination and implementation process. So with that, I think, I don't know how I'm doing on time, but I'm going to stop there. I think I'm right on time. Okay. Happy to take any questions.
So I think we have mics around the room, and online we'll also look for questions. Chris, will you help us if there's questions that come in online? Great. So thanks so much, Tracy. That was great. One of the things I'm curious about, seeing lots of projects around the country and really interesting work that you guys have funded. What do you think has been kind of the secret sauce in terms of collaboration within systems for kind of communicating the importance of trials, getting the right sort of integration within delivery systems so that everyone is kind of effectively engaged in doing this? And that I'm interested, particularly everything from kind of how clinicians who may or may not be involved with the study are communicating with patients, how consent approaches get integrated, kind of what makes this work?
Well, that's a really big question because, there really is no one size fits all. Every health system is a little different. A lot of the studies that we do are, that we fund are multi-centered studies. And so we definitely see that kind of diversity across. I think one of the things that Rob Califf told me that I kind of kept in mind is you just have to align incentives properly. I mean, nothing, and those incentives are in part financial incentives, but also there are many of non-financial incentives that are important to align. So when you think about sort of the design of the project, First of all, if you just design it with only one set of incentives in mind, there's this idea that all you need to do is recruit patients into your trial, you're probably not going to be incredibly successful with your trial. You're going to struggle, like many of our clinical trials do, because there's just no buy-in. There's no buy-in from patients, there's no buy-in from clinicians, there's no buy-in from the health system. And at the end of the day, even with your results are down, people are just are out. People are just going to look at this and say, well, that's all well and good, but ... kind of thing. So early engagement, I think, is one of the key things here. I have heard some of our applicants say that, and it's not atypical, but they often start the research design process a year in advance of the application even being submitted, so that they have those stakeholders in place and they really have that kind of, gravitas to be able to do this. And in some studies, and I'm always curious which applicants are able to do this, they've even managed to pilot test a few things. Now, I'm always curious about that, because when I was an academic faculty, like, where do you find the money to pilot test things? But it's actually incredibly helpful. And from a peer review standpoint, from an application, which is kind of firewalled from my division, but when I listen in on some of these conversations, I find that that's actually, there's a healthy dose of skepticism among peer reviewers that are kind of like, yeah, this is a great study, but are they really going to get the study done? And so having that, laying that groundwork, aligning those incentives, I think is really, really critical to success on the research front, but also on many of the other aspects of the research product.
Fascinating concept that we'd be concerned about what patients want and what they think about. I'm Andy Smith. My career's been in heart failure, and we had been very successful in enrolling patients in clinical trials. And Gene Braunwald asked me to speak to our group one time about how we did that. And I said, we do it by having our patients trust us, and they'll make decisions if they think that we care about their best outcomes. And you do that by building relationships. And I think your PCORI group gets at some of this. I hear people talking about, I practice guideline-directed medicine. This is the medicine, I give it to the patient, whatever. And then it turns out, the next appointment, the patient comes to me and said, should I really be taking this? Or they may not be taking it, right? So I just wonder whether eventually within the guidelines we'll have suggestions and ways of actually implementing the outcomes. You talk about engagement and maybe engaging somebody in a trial, but engaging somebody in actually what you want them to do. Businesses do this very well. They do market research. They know how, when someone comes in and shops in a store, they don't say, can I help you? What do you want? They say, hey, is it raining out there? Or, what's the weather like? And they create a relationship. Do we see some of this ways of getting people to do things eventually coming into guidelines? And then just a final comment is we measure, hospitals get rated in clinics on patient satisfaction, and you have people running behind to, create better environment and things or correct problems that may have occurred. But I don't think we're currently being graded on whether patients are actually taking their medicines or engaging in things. And do you see that eventually that may be a way that we are rated?
Great questions. So having spent 3 years at PCORI and sort of looked at a lot of the portfolio of research that we funded, I would say about almost half of our portfolio are what I call systems level studies, where we're focused on how to get things done. And a lot of them is really focused on how to get quote unquote patients to do what they're supposed to do. Although I don't like saying it that way. I'm told never to say this that way, because that puts the blame squarely on the patient, whereas it's really a systems problem. It's also really interesting in that, we've funded a lot of research so far that have really tried to tackle some of these questions, like using community health workers as a adjunct to the clinical or health systems workforce to help with some of the educational aspects. We funded work on shared decision-making. We funded work on, cultural ambassadors, if you will, knowing that there are different groups that might have higher prevalence of non-adherence or greater variabilities in care. We've looked at peer navigators. All of them work to a certain extent. And so from a health systems implementation standpoint, it's a little bit of, is a bang worth your buck? Now, we're not able to fund cost effectiveness research, but we provide the clinical evidence and the data for others to do that. My general sense from that is these all come at a cost. And so you cannot universally apply these. You have to think about which populations they might be most effective in. And that takes some more sort of D&I type of dissemination and implementation work. I'm also, thinking that, as technology improves and, you drive by on the street, most people are walking like this. They're not talking to people anymore. That there are other ways to motivate behavior change that maybe doesn't require people power per se, but it might require brain power and technology power. Which isn't to say people power isn't central to all this, because going back to your original comment, trust is important, and trust is harder to earn these days than it used to be. And I think here at Emory, you are in an environment where you've had decades to build that trust with the community, and so that goodwill stays a little bit longer. But medicine is getting quite transactional. So there are new challenges to trust building. And we certainly saw that during the pandemic as well. So lots of great ideas, but, I think, and we're funding a lot of really interesting research in that area. I think there's definitely more to come to try to get at that golden egg of, trust, accountability, activation, engagement, but to ultimately result in better patient outcomes. I see a hand raised online. Dr. Burke?
Yeah, thank you. Great talk, very thought-provoking. I think you were sort of starting to allude to what I wanted to ask toward the end of your last comment there. So going back to your Artemis study and kind of framing that in what I wanted to ask about PCORI. So, the 28% of people that didn't use the voucher, looking at the outcomes, I'm presuming they're basically the non-adherent patients, right? So considering what we've seen on many levels over the last few years, I feel like at least a portion of those patients that's due to the, this flagging faith that we're seeing that people have in science. So are there PCORI funded investigations specifically to target like medical misinformation?
There is. There's a good chunk of the portfolio focused on health communication. We also have some great method studies focused on building trust in the research process. Neil, I think you've maybe been part of that as well. There's also, things like shared decision-making, and I'm almost a little afraid to say this in this environment. We have a couple of studies on vaccine hesitancy. So yeah, I think there is a lot of different angles, and it's obviously more general to just cardiovascular care. I would almost say that cardiovascular care is perhaps some of the more straightforward. We have robust evidence, and so a lot of this is really trying to a robust, mostly unquestionable evidence. So a lot of this is really focused on communication and absorption of that information, whereas in other health disciplines, there is skepticism about this, a lot more skepticism about the research, where the evidence perhaps is less concrete, and there's a lot more work to do.
I think I think we're at time. I just want to thank Tracy again for being here, sharing her work and the work of PCORI with us. So wonderful start to a year of grand rounds, and thanks for helping us to kick it off. Thanks.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.